Hello and welcome again to What I Did Next from A&T Media. I'm Malak Fuad. On the show, we delve into people's life journeys from the point of view of twists and turns, shifts and pivots. We've all had them. Some are more visible than others and make us stop in our track and make a course correction. Others only come into focus with hindsight, when we look back and realize that a particular moment in time was pivotal in our lives. This is the essence of What I Did Next. I'm joined today by poet, author, radio host, and all-round badass, Salma El-Wardany. Salma, who is of Irish and Egyptian descent, can also lay claim to influences from the Pakistani community of northern England, as well as her current home in multicultural London. Questions of identity are at the core of who Salma is, and this is at the heart of much of her writing, public speaking, and poetry. She is the author of These Impossible Things, a best-selling novel that breaks down barriers by looking at how a group of Muslim girlfriends navigate love, friendship, and sex. She also currently hosts The Breakfast Show on weekday mornings on BBC Radio London. The show has propelled Salma into the stratosphere, reaching over 500,000 listeners daily. I find Salma's story fascinating, uplifting, and hopeful. She pushes the boundaries of what is acceptable discussion around morality and religion. She's also given voice to what many modern women from Jakarta to Jeddah are talking about behind closed doors. Could it be that her mixed heritage has given her the license and freedom to speak freely, or is she reflecting what is visible around her, not just in Europe, but also in the Middle East and beyond? Perhaps it's just that she's not afraid to speak her mind. Salma is perhaps best described in her own words. She has written, "Heartbreak found me, as it often does, and as my chest cracked open, the poems poured out. I discovered the stage, learned that it felt like home, wrote in the early hours, wrote with the dawn, wrote in the dark. I got published, I was commissioned, I gave keynote speeches, I fought for women, I stood with my sisters, I fought with my pen, I wrote stories, I still write stories." Salma, tell me, how do you define yourself in terms of a profession? Because you wear so many hats. You're a writer, you're a poet, you're a radio host. If someone was to talk to you at a party and say, "What do you do?" what would you answer?
The first thing that always comes out of my mouth is that I'm a writer.
Right.
I'm a writer. And I say the thing that ties all of the things together that I do, because I have my own business as well, and I work within the corporate world. I am, at my very core, I am a storyteller. And I tell stories, and I tell them in different mediums and in different ways. The most natural and the most instinctive and intuitive to me is as a writer. That is my core being. That is what I believe I have a little bit of talent in, and that I've then worked really hard to hone that little bit.
You have a lot of talent in it, Salma, not a little bit.
You're very kind.
No, and you're able to go from different genres as well. So you published a novel. Is your new book also a novel?
Yes, the second one that I'm working on, it's a novel as well. But of course, I've done nonfiction in various anthologies and poetry collections.
And poetry, yeah.
Yeah, but I think that the core of it is, I tell a story, right? That's what I do. I tell a story every morning when I go on air, 'cause I host the breakfast show on BBC Radio London. Every single morning when that microphone goes live and I go on air, I tell stories to the citizens of London about what is happening, whether that's something awful that's happened overnight, right? I tell that story. Here's what's happened. This is how it happened. This is where it happened. And I'm here with you as a character in this story to go through this story with you. Or, for example, this morning, actually, right now, today in the UK, the law has just changed so that it's now illegal to get married under the age of 18. So you cannot get married in this country, even with parental consent, unless you're 18.
I didn't realize that it had been allowed, actually.
The law just
Oh, wow.
changed 27th of February. They will talk about it in the
Gosh.
history books.
Yeah.
So I had someone on my show who had been a victim of child marriage, as had her sister. Her sister tried to leave, and her sister was murdered in an honor killing. And she has been instrumental in this bill. And so that's the story I told of this woman and of other girls who had had child marriages and what that meant to them and how they had overcome it or not, and why it was important to change things to protect them. So you're still telling this story, right? And then if I go into my business, and I do a lot of work with diversity and inclusion with businesses and how they can create diverse businesses. I tell a story of those diverse individuals, of what it means to be moving through the world, the challenges that they face, and how they can change the narrative of their business so it is a more welcoming and accommodating place. So it's all storytelling. But first and foremost, I do it with with the page and
With your pen and your
with
paper.
my pen
Yeah,
and my
yeah,
paper.
yeah.
Yeah.
And tell me about the public persona that you have, because you've done a lot of TED Talks, you've done public speaking. How did that come about, and what was the motivation for that for you?
I mean, it wasn't intentional, believe it or not. It was all. This is such a cliche. I'm going to tell you. I was heartbroken, and so I always say this: my heart broke and outspilled the poems and poetry. I have
Yeah.
always written to make sense of the world and to deal with things, right? So then I wrote. I took to the page as I always have done in life, and they came out in poems. And I decided to start posting those poems on my Instagram. And at the same time, previously, before the heartbreak and before the poetry, I had submitted my book to various publishers and no one wanted it. They didn't want it.
Oh, so you have actually written your first book a long time ago, and you were just trying to get it
The
published.
version that's out now is very different.
Of
It's
course,
same
but your
premise,
original draft.
original
Yeah,
draft, first few
right.
chapters. And I submitted it and nobody wanted it. And we were it was kind of like 2013, 14, and the climate was so anti-Muslim is the only way that I can put it. And we'd had the Paris bombings, and we'd had
Yeah,
the attack at the Charlie Hebdo
yeah.
offices,
There was a
and
lot going
there
on.
was
Yeah, there was
so
a lot
much
going
going
on
on,
then.
and publishers didn't want to touch it. They said they liked it, but they kind of didn't know what to do with it. And I worked in marketing at the same time, and I remember thinking, I know how this works. If I have a brand and if I hold a community, you will come to me. And I had so many rejections, and I thought, well, do you know what? I'm going to build a brand, and then you are going to come knocking on my door. So I'll do it the other way instead.
Oh, how interesting, Salma. It was a very conscious building of your
Yeah,
brand.
and I didn't know what that would look like, right? But I knew I was going to build a community online because I'd already done it on Twitter. So I already knew that I could do it and that I understood it intrinsically in a certain way. And so then I was going to do it on Instagram, and then they were going to come knocking on my door. I didn't know what that brand would lead to. So I started posting things on Instagram, and I started writing more and being really honest. I mean, I always say this, my soul is on Instagram. And I started being really honest about my experiences as a woman, what it meant to be a woman, what it meant to be a woman in love with a guy, and heartbreak and all of the messy things. And it just grew and grew and grew. And then I got asked to contribute to spoken word nights. And then I was doing spoken word nights and I was performing them around the world. And then I was, being asked to contribute to poetry anthologies. And then someone had seen me do spoken word and asked me to do a TED talk. And then they asked me to do another TED talk.
And one thing led to another, yeah. But you've definitely tapped into, the whole Muslim girl leading her life, her truth. It's it's a new phenomenon. When I was growing up, it was never something that was on our radar at all,
Yeah,
to look at our life through the lens of religion.
right,
Um, the books we were reading that were coming out of the region, if you want something like Ahdaf Suif,
right.
it was much more about the political awakening of women,
Absolutely.
and through the lens of how do you relate to the state? How do you relate to your country on a national level? But the religious element was never a factor, And like me, I know a lot of people who grew up in the UK as Muslims,
Mm,
um, or as Christians for that matter. But mainly, if you're looking at it from the religion point of view, that was different to what was, on offer in the UK. We never thought of ourselves through that prism. It was never something that was a factor for us. And that's a generational shift, I think.
yeah, I think so.
I think 9/11 is the turning point for that, because prior to that, it was never an issue. Your religion was your religion and you just got on with things. It was never considered a differentiating point.
Yeah.
But clearly, your generation, it is a major, major paradigm shift.
Right, because it was, and because suddenly it was political. It wasn't just the fact that you were Muslim and it was this private thing. It was political and it was part of the public consciousness and it
Absolutely.
was part of the public debate suddenly. And so either you had to double down on that and be pretty steadfast in that, or you had to defend it, or you had to denounce it. You had to take this stand. And it was so
Yeah.
jarring to what had previously been quite a private experience. And I always say this, my religion, my faith is between me and God. That's it. There's no one else. There's no one else in this equation. It's just between me and a higher being, and we have chats and we square it up and we're good with each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But it was suddenly became part of the public discourse. And, people would ask me, what did ISIS want? And why were they doing what they were doing? As if I had any insight into
Absolutely.
that. And, or I would go out in a mini skirt, but I thought you were Muslim. I thought you had, and because they've
Yeah.
got this image from the media of these, fully veiled. They have one idea of a Muslim, one idea. So every time you kissed a boy or went on a date or wore a miniskirt or got drunk, you were not conforming to what their idea of a Muslim was. And you might go out and wear a miniskirt and kiss a boy and get drunk, but then you would turn around and you would say, actually, I want to marry a Muslim. And they would go, but hang on, that doesn't fit either, because you're not a rebel, but now you're conforming, but you won't conform on these things. And now you don't fit our picture, our very simplistic picture of what we think a Muslim to be. And so it was all kind of part of the public narrative.
I also think that, we're at that first phase where there's like a reality check about how the West sees us. And 50 years down the line, this conversation wouldn't be happening.
I hope
Our
so.
conversation wouldn't be happening, because there would have already been an acceptance, an awareness, an infiltration or an assimilation, and just an acceptance of all these issues,
Right.
So that's interesting. I just want to go back a step, and look to your childhood, your parents. So I know that your father's Egyptian, your mother's Irish,
Yeah.
and I know that your parents split up and you eventually came to the UK. But take me back a little bit further, and sort of, how did they meet, first of all, and then your early years.
Yeah. So my mum was living in London. My father was there on some business. Um, and they fell in love. I think my mum was lured by the promise of living by the pyramids. I think it was a romantic notion, because we all know, those of us who are Egyptian will know, that being next to the pyramids is an absolute shit show.
It's
And
exactly, it's not where you want to be living.
this is nowhere near where you want to raise a family or anything.
Absolutely.
So, but she did. She skipped off to Egypt. They fell in love on the streets of London, and she ended up on the streets of Cairo. And she lived there for some 9 years and learned the language, reads it, writes it, speaks it perfectly. And that's where I was born. So I was born. Let me take you to Fayoum, which is actually where I was born.
And why were you born in Fayoum? Is that where your father's from?
No, ridiculous. It's a ridiculous twist of it. Apparently, so legend has it. So my father was a little bit of a you don't have this reference in Egypt, I don't think, but yeah, anyone who knows the TV show Only Fools and Horses, he was a little bit of a
Yeah,
Del Boy.
Del Boy.
So he's always
I know Del
wheeling and
Boy.
dealing,
Yeah.
always living on the never never, always waiting for the next big thing to hit. Something just tomorrow was going to make them millionaires. It was always about to happen, always clutching onto dreams and chasing after different dreams. Apparently, he'd always wanted to be a farmer. I mean, who knows why? So they end up
The romantic notion of the gentleman farmer, probably.
exactly. Like these,
Yeah.
and you know what the Egyptians are like. They're overly romantic and dramatic, and they get carried away with
Yeah,
themselves.
absolutely.
There we go. So he ended up on this farm in Fayoum with a cow or whatever, and that's where I was born. And
Wow.
then eventually, obviously, that didn't work. Of course, it didn't work. So they ended up
Yeah.
back in the city, and we lived there until I was kind of 3-4 years old. And then, the dream never became a reality, and it was always struggling for money or to feed the kids. And my mum couldn't afford to feed us, and I don't know what my dad was doing. He was living on
Yeah.
living on another dream, right? And so she came back to England. My granny's
And you have a younger sibling?
older, so my brother's 2 years older
Oh,
than me.
older. I
Yeah.
see.
And
Okay.
so
Right.
my mum, with 2 babes in arms, she headed back
Yeah.
to the UK. They got divorced, and a few years later she met my dad, who he's my stepdad, but I still call him
Yes.
my dad, because he was kind of the only man who ever raised me. And I always say that it takes more than genetics to be a father.
Absolutely. And did you keep in touch with your biological father?
No, never heard from him. And then he died when I was about 12. So I'd never heard hide nor hair of him. And then after he died, my mum took us back, and she always stayed in touch with his family because she felt that was important for us. And we used to spend summers back in Egypt with my aunties and my cousins. But I
Oh, well,
never,
that's good because at least you didn't lose that connection
no, I think that was
to that
yeah, I
family.
think that was
Yeah.
something my mum fought really hard for and made sure
That's
that it
so
was,
impressive that she did that. Yeah.
yeah, well, yeah, because she could have just said, forget
Yeah.
it. I mean, you didn't
Absolutely.
come through for me, so I don't need to be there for you, right? But she is a remarkable woman, and so she kept that connection alive, and then I've always had a relationship with them because of that.
And in a lot of what you've spoken about, you've spoken many times about your sort of this part of your identity, about the fact that you are several sort of nationalities mixed in together. You very rarely talk about your mom. So you've talked a lot about your father. You've talked a lot about your Pakistani stepfather and his family, sort of by extension, and the world of growing up in an Asian home in
Yeah,
the UK.
yeah.
But you've I haven't read anything that you've said or heard anything you said about your actual mother,
That's so
who's
interesting.
Irish. Tell me about her.
That's so interesting because I find I always mention her in interviews. And I remember one time my mum said, "Stop mentioning me, like I'm not that great." And obviously I told her that she was that great. And she was like, "I haven't done anything." And I did tell her she made me. So you did something,
Exactly, that's enough.
right? You can retire on that. It's fine.
Absolutely,
But yeah, my
absolutely.
mum's Irish. She lives in the northeast of England now. She's a remarkably intelligent woman. She home educated me and my brother. So she took us out of school when we were about 6 because she just felt like we weren't learning enough and the education system wasn't good enough, and taught us everything that we know until the age of
Wow,
16. And then when we were
that's
16,
incredible, Selma.
yeah, remarkable.
It really is. I mean, for someone who did that to say that she's done nothing with her life, I mean, give her a medal. That's incredible.
I know.
It
And
really is,
I
yeah.
think
And very difficult to do.
right, and I
Yeah,
think since lockdown, when parents had to home educate their kids, they realized they realized just
absolutely.
how hard that was.
Absolutely.
But yeah, she's a brilliant, brilliant mind, and just didn't really think the education system was benefiting us. And I have to say, we didn't have formal lessons when I was a kid. We didn't sit down from 9 to 10 and do maths and then English. That just wasn't the way it was. She would take us to museums and to lectures and to workshops, and we went on bike rides around the country and just
Mm,
learn as we went through life. And when I asked a question, she would send me off to the library to figure out the answer myself and come back and tell her the
mhm.
answer.
When we come back, Selma tells us about her move to Egypt after university in a tale that is both hilarious and touching. That's right after this short break. Welcome back to What I Did Next. I'm Malak Fuad, and you're listening to my conversation with Salma El-Wardany. You finished your studies in the UK, then you came to Egypt. So you came on a quest to find a little bit who your dad was, your family?
I think a quest is a lovely way of putting it. Yeah. So I had been raised in the northeast of England, born in Egypt, but raised in the northeast of England with an Irish mother and a Pakistani stepfather. So I came home every day and no one looked like me outside of the house and no one looked like me inside of the house, right? So it's this real dissonance when no one actually looks like you. And so you don't know where you quite belong. And I had this yearning for Egypt, and I had this, and we'd gone back when I was a
Yeah.
kid, and every time I went back, all my aunties would tell me was, "Oh my God, you are the spitting image of your father, and you look like him, and not even that, you act like him, your mannerisms, you have the same humor, and how do you have the same mannerisms when you were never together in a room with each
Yeah.
other for that?"
It's unbelievable how that is. Yeah.
Uncanny. And so I was constantly fed this narrative, and I was like, I wanted to go back and I wanted to learn the language properly and I wanted to spend time in Egypt. And I did a degree and I did a master's, and I had spent 4 years in the library because I am a diligent student. And so I thought, before I go into offices and my life as an adult, I need to go and have this quest, this
Get it out of your system, basically, right? You need to get it out of your system.
right.
Yeah.
And I was looking for something. I was
Yeah.
searching for a huge part of me, right? Some way that I could claim Egyptianness more, because I felt like I didn't have a valid claim to it because I didn't even speak the language properly.
But were you searching for it, Selma, because you felt out of place In England?
Well, the thing is, I've always been out of place. I'm out of place
Yeah.
in England because they see me as a foreigner. I'm out of place with my Pakistani community because I don't look like them and I don't speak the language either. And then I'm out of place in Egypt, عشان I'm أجنبية, right? So
Yeah.
I still
Yeah.
don't fit. So, I mean, what it taught me was that I was still out of place and that if I wanted to belong to this place, I was going to have to take it for myself and no one was going to give it to me. And I would have to stand up and say, I'm Egyptian and I belong here and this is my country. So I packed up my bags, I went to Egypt. I ended up in the desert between Scandria and Cairo, working in a horse ranch on this farm.
Why did you do that? Can I just ask, what made you go and do that?
You ask that like I'm a crazy person. Oh, why would you do that? Which is a fair question. It's a fair question.
Were you earthy? Were
No,
you outdoorsy?
I'm a very outdoorsy person and I like the outdoors and I always loved camping and hiking and I've always been into
Yeah.
that. And I liked horse riding. I'll tell you the truth. I hadn't done that much of it. We couldn't afford to ride horses when
Yeah.
we didn't have any money growing up, right? No one was taking me to the stables on a Saturday morning to ride
Sure.
my pony. That
Yeah.
was not a reality. And so, but it was something that I had in my head and I wanted to do. And so my mum had a friend, this white woman, and she had gone out to the middle of the desert between Scandria and Cairo. She'd bought this farm. So I get on the plane. I can get picked up at the airport and I go straight to Scandria. Like, well, it's not Scandria, it's between, okay?
Yeah. It's a desert road.
It's
Yeah.
like nowhere, okay? And then for the next 5 months, I work on this farm. I get up and my responsibility was the animals. I mean, what qualified me for that? Nothing. But I am a huge believer that whatever I lack in ability or talent, I will make up for in hard work. So I got up every morning at 4 o'clock in the morning and I milked the cow and I let the chickens out and I fed the chickens and I fed the goats and the sheeps and the rabbits and I mucked out the stables.
And presumably you learned the language because you're talking to people around you who are working with you.
So I actually learned like very specific farm. So I got back when I did get back to the city, like I knew the words for rake.
Farm jargon.
Yeah, like I knew how the words for rake and hay and stables and stuff, but I didn't know how to order in a restaurant. Do you know what I mean? So it was really
I love this story. It's
it was really
hilarious.
strange, but I learned so much. Someone sat there with me the first day and showed me how to milk this cow, and from then on, it was my responsibility, sun up and sun down, to milk the cow and take the milk into the house, and that's everything we ate from the farm. If we wanted chicken for dinner, I learned how to get a chicken, slaughter it, gut it, pluck it, and cook it. I learned it from the whole cycle of it.
If you get thrown on a desert island, you'll know how to survive basically because
100%, I'm fine.
your survival skills are there.
Stay with me.
And then
I will look
yeah,
after you.
exactly. And then what? After 5 months, you realized you needed to see more.
Yeah, I was like, I'm done. I'm good here.
Yeah.
And I mean, listen, let me tell you, I have never been in better shape than when I lived on that farm
I
and
can imagine.
ate from
I
the
can
land
imagine.
and worked physical
And no
labor.
processed food. And you're
Nothing.
exercising all day long.
Every
and yeah.
day. I mean, mucking out cow shit is a workout you would not believe because
I
that
can imagine.
sticks to the ground like
Yeah,
anything.
yeah.
So 5 months there, I thought, "Khalas, yeah, I'm done. Like I'm
Mm.
ready. I'm ready to go to the city."
And in your mind, was this like a gap year or was this the start of the rest of your life?
No, I think in my head I left to go to Egypt and I said, I'm going to go for a year. I ended up
Yes.
being there for 2.5 years. But I when I was there, I just thought, we're going to just do this until it doesn't feel good anymore, right?
Yeah,
And it
yeah,
feels
yeah.
so good right now. It was incredible. So I just threw myself into it, head and heart, and went for it. So I've done the farm. I moved to Egypt on the 24th of January 2011.
It's unbelievable.
The very next day is obviously Khamsa Yanair, is the 25th of January, is the revolution begins. Any prospect of a job in international business is now a dream and a myth because the city goes into curfew and a lockdown essentially.
Yeah, it was a very traumatic time for a lot of people. The older generation as well just lost it.
Yeah, and it was unsafe, right? Like I remember the bullets
It was
singing
unsafe.
around our
Yeah.
neighborhood as well. And the friends that I'd moved in with, their parents called them back, get back on a plane. All the kind of expat people I knew had left the country. The British embassy had sent me a message saying, we're putting a plane on for all our citizens, get on the plane and get out of the country, basically, because we can't guarantee your safety after this. Mm-hmm. And my mum called me and she said in Arabic, she said, get down to the street and go and fight for your country.
No way. I love it. Well, she's got the Irish in her. She's a
Yeah,
fighter. There was a
exactly.
parallel that she could relate
Exactly.
to.
She's a
Yeah,
revolutionary through and through. And she
totally.
was like, I wish I was there. And she had been there 30 years previously when Mubarak had been voted in or had gotten in the first
Yeah.
place. And so she said, like, and go and fight for your country. And so I did. And I remember being very cognizant at the time that history was happening. I was so aware of that. And I said that to my cousins. I said, they're going to write about this day and we will have lived
Hmm.
it. It won't be
Yeah.
history to us.
Yeah.
We can say we were there in Tahrir. And my female cousins wouldn't go, but I went with my male cousins, and we went and we
Well,
protest.
because you were different, right? You were not considered local. You were foreign. So you could get away with things that a lot of people couldn't get away with.
Beloved. And you know what? I was so aware of that privilege because there were many a time that I got caught out after curfew and I got stopped by the army. And I always pretended that I did not speak a word of Arabic and I put on my best British accent and
Mm,
pretended I didn't know anything and just smiled. And I always got away with it. And I know that my cousins would not have had that privilege.
absolutely.
So then I was there. I was in a revolution, fighting, writing about it for everyone back home. And that was the next stage.
And after that, you decided to leave, or did you stay on a little bit longer in Egypt?
No, I stayed. I got a job once life came back to work and the curfews were lifted. So I was protesting the revolution and then my auntie also taught me to knit. So we would spend a lot of time indoors after curfew knitting. I didn't knit anything. I just knitted this long thing that made no shape
Yeah, it's just the
whatsoever.
the manualness of it.
Beloved.
Yeah,
And we would
yeah.
have cauliflower sandwiches every day because that's always what I wanted to eat. And I baked with my cousins and we knitted and then I would go out in the revolution.
When we come back, we see how Selma's life pivoted her back to the UK and how she continues to change the narrative through her radio work. Welcome back. I'm Malak Fuad, and this is my conversation with Salma El-Wardany. What was a turning point for you out of what you've spoken about so far?
Yeah, I think coming to Egypt and working on that farm was incredible. But I think the real shift happened when I had moved to Cairo and I was living with my friends. And I guess I mean I didn't move out for university. So it was the first time I was living and paying bills and being responsible for myself in that way and being alone in the world and being accountable and having what I imagine people have when they go to university and having this widening of the horizons, this widening of life, this thrilling experience. And I was in love with life. Life was beautiful and incredible. I was earning an expat salary. I was eating in the best restaurants. I was surrounded by friends and laughter. And it was an incredible, it was an
Mm-hmm.
incredible time. And I think that was a real turning point for me and my development and the person that I was growing to be.
And you've spoken about at this time of your life, you were in a relationship with an Egyptian. You were very in love, and then it turned sour.
Yeah, so I think meeting him was a turning point. I met him when we were both kind of traveling back to the UK for summer. He's Egyptian and we had a thrilling romance and fell in love, but he was controlling and he was abusive and he was manipulative, and those things didn't take long to start coming through. And then suddenly, as quickly as I had become this new person that I had grown into, I then became someone else, right? I became someone who was scared and worried and watched my words and watched what I said and who I talked to and how much I smiled at a guy just in case that was misconstrued into something. I stopped telling my male friends that I missed them back home because that had been overheard on the phone once and that did not end well. Um, and I became a different person once more. And I was in that relationship for about 2 years. And there was another turning point when we both decided, and we lived together in Cairo. And there was another turning point when we both decided, and he was born and raised in London. We decided that it was time to come home because political unease can only get you so far. And I was really aware that I was having a good time, but I was aware that I wasn't progressing my life, that I wasn't learning anything new. I already knew that teaching was not for me and that was not a profession that I was going to stay in. Um, I mean, milking the cow was easier than teaching, I tell you that much. And so I was so aware that I wasn't developing, and I am hungry to always develop. If I spend a whole year and I am the same at the end of that year as I was at the beginning, I know that I have failed and I've wasted a year. So I knew that I wasn't developing. So we decided to go back home. I moved back in with my family for a while I was looking for work in London. I got a job eventually in London, and I mean the relationship had deteriorated so much over this time and was so abusive and nasty and cruel. And by the time I moved to London, which was when we were going to get engaged, that was when he told me that it was all over and that for no reason at all. Um, and then a month later, he was married. So that was another turning point.
It's interesting because what my perception of you is that you're a very strong girl, and very sure of yourself. But it takes just one relationship like that when you're young, and if it's your first really important relationship, it just completely throws you. It's very hard to find your footing and make decisions for yourself. You knew from the beginning probably that it wasn't didn't feel right, but you still stayed.
Right. And I remember thinking, to your point, I remember thinking when I was in this abusive relationship, I remember thinking, how did this happen to me, of all people, who doesn't take shit from anyone and who is so confident and so vocal and outspoken? How has this happened to me? And I remember thinking, oh, it's not about how confident you are, it's not about how vocal you are. It's about power and men having it and wielding it over you, and that it doesn't care how confident you are. And I remember having that thought and being so shocked and surprised by it, and so it was as if all the ground had moved under me, having that realization. And also, you have to bear in mind, I had this deep, yearning ache to be Egyptian. And I think we
Yeah.
try to cement our identity in the people opposite us, in the friends that we make, in the circles that we keep, and in the relationships that we have. You fit the bill. And I thought somehow through you, I'm going to be more Egyptian
Whole, and I'll be whole.
and I'll be whole, right?
Yeah,
And the
yeah,
irony
yeah,
is
yeah,
that that relationship fragmented me into a thousand
yeah.
pieces.
And so when it ended and he ended it, you fell apart, right? That's exactly what you're saying now.
I think I had fallen apart in the relationship because
Within
I
it,
think when
yeah,
you are in an abusive relationship, and anyone who has been unfortunate enough to be in these situations, they will tell you that the breaking happens over time. And by the time you get to the end of that, you're already broken. It's done. The
yeah,
damage is done.
yeah,
And so he walked out of that out of my house, and I for years I didn't speak about it. I didn't say his name. My friends weren't allowed to say his name. I threw myself heart and soul into my work. I worked every hour. I worked nights. I mean, I did very well at it, as a result. But I just didn't talk about it. I didn't deal with it, and I
hmm
just got on with life. And for quite a few years, I couldn't love anyone. I couldn't let anyone love me. It was just my work, and nothing was going to get in the way of that or break me into more pieces.
And how did you get over it in the end? Was it that you met someone new, or was it a question of just time healing it?
God, no. Do you know what? I would say, I don't know if I'm,
It's a hard question because there's a catalyst along the way sometimes as well.
I think time does heal everything eventually. But I think personally, and anyone I've spoken to who's been in an abusive relationship, I think you are irrevocably changed. That you are never the same person you once were. I am so aware that the woman I was going into that relationship has been lost to me forever. And that even though bad things had happened in my life to me, and even though there had been hardships, there was a lightness in me. That's the only way I can really describe it.
Yeah,
I had
yeah,
light
yeah.
in me. And
A carefreeness.
almost, even though I had
Yeah.
experienced real hardships, but once he had came and gone, there was a darkness in me that
It's
I've,
a loss of innocence, Selma, I think, is probably what you're searching for. It's that naivety or that trustingness,
yeah,
you
perhaps
know?
that was
Yeah.
it. But there was something that was forever changed in me.
Yeah. And subsequent relationships, are you more on guard? Are you more aware? Are there signs that do you have alarm bells that go off if certain things appear on the radar? I mean,
Yeah, I think so. And I think you naturally do. And I remember being
yeah.
in something with someone and ending it and walking away from it in the end. And I remember some of their behavior when they got really angry and they shouted. And I remember thinking, oh, I've seen this
Mhm.
before. I've seen
Yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah.
And I remember having the thought, I did not work this hard to become the woman that I am today to put up with behavior like that. I did not go
Yeah,
through all the things that I went through. I did not survive that man to put up with your shit
absolutely.
now. So I
Absolutely.
have a lower tolerance.
So let's talk a little bit about your first novel.
Yeah.
It's written from the point of view of three women. Tell me about it. How did you think it up?
Well, this book started, I think I wrote the first sentence when I was living in Egypt and searching for a way to put this story on the
Aid
page.
sex.
Aid sex.
Aid
There
sex.
you go. That's the thing that we all have questions about. Do you know what this book was born years before? So I did my degree in literature, and then I did a master's in uh, children's literature. And I specifically looked at young adult literature, and my thesis was all about the representation of Muslims within literature. And I looked across the Western world, so America, New Zealand, Australia, the UK. What do those stories say about Muslim kids or Muslim women and Muslim men? What's the narrative? And obviously, you already know it was awful, it was terrible, it was shocking. And I remember thinking, well, this isn't me and my girlfriends. This isn't us at all. And so I'm going to write the story. I'm going to write the real story. And I always knew I wanted to be a writer. I always knew I wanted to write novels. And I said, this is going to be the first one. This is going to be where I start, because this is bullshit and this isn't our lived experience and this isn't how we live. And I want to see us on the page. We don't exist anywhere on the page. And I was a kid when 9/11 happened, and I was so aware of the shift in society and the narrative and how often we now got shouted at in the street in comparison. 9/11 changed my life.
But you were like what, 11, 12, something like
So
that? Yeah,
and so I was aware of it. I remember where I was when I was watching it. I remember getting the
yeah.
news. Um, and it changed my life as it did many other kids. And life got so much harder then. And especially living in the northeast of England. I wasn't living in London. It wasn't multicultural. I was the
Yeah.
darkest thing on the
You were the only
train,
one
right?
there. Yeah.
So life just got very hard at that point. And I remember thinking when I was in university, life is so hard for us because we have no positive representations in media, in film, in Hollywood, on TV series, in our pages of our literature. And so I thought, I'm gonna write it in. There's that Maya Angelou quote, if there's a story that you want to read that's not written, then write it. And so I thought I'd better write it. And that's why I decided to start with this book, with three Muslim women who were ambitious and hungry and had passions and big dreams. And they wanted to go off and do all of those things. And they were in love and falling in and out of love. And they were sexual, and they had a hunger for more in this life. And they just so happened to be Muslim. The fact that they were Muslim wasn't the main narrative, wasn't the reason that they were in the story. They were three women like any other women around the world dealing with things women do. They just happen to be Muslim as well.
I want to just ask you a little bit about, we touched about it early on, your work with as a radio host, how that's a shift. I mean, that's a big change for you. You're now known to a much wider audience of people who would not necessarily have known who you were before. You're if you, for want of a better word, you've gone mainstream in a way, right? You're on London BBC Radio. So
Yeah.
it's you're reaching a huge audience. You're talking about things that are not at all where you had placed your brand, if you like, previously. How is that, and how is your day-to-day life now? Because you clearly have the radio show in the morning, and then you're working on these edits in the evening. So just walk me through a little bit how that's all going.
It's tiring, I'm not going to lie. I
Yeah.
Listen, let me tell you, when I was a kid, when I was maybe 6, 7, I used to wake up really early when I was a kid. I don't know why I had this compulsion. I used to wake up really early. I used to wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I would write a fictional news headline. And I would put on a cardigan because it was the smartest thing that I owned in lieu of like a blazer. And I would sit and shuffle my papers up and down, and I would
How
read the
cute.
6 o'clock news, my fictional
How
6 o'clock news.
adorable.
I mean, everyone in my house would shout, "Shut up, we're sleeping." But every morning I would read this fictional 6 o'clock news. And we didn't have a TV growing up. My mum threw it out. She said it was a waste of time. We didn't learn anything. But all we had was the radio. And we had Radio 4. I woke up to Radio 4 and I fell asleep to Radio 4. I know exactly the schedule of Radio 4. I know when things come on. I know what the Sunday schedule is. I lived by it. I set my clock by the Radio 4 schedule. And I loved radio. I adore radio. And I've always been a real radio head. So, and then there I was as a kid doing my fictional radio briefings in the morning. And so it seems, when you look back on it, it seems little wonder that I am now in radio. And yet it was, I didn't plan it. I didn't go to bed at night saying I'm gonna be a radio host when I grow up. But this brand had built, and someone said they're holding pilots at Radio London, and I think you would be great. Do you want to come in and try one and just sit for a pilot? And I said, and I'm a huge believer in say yes and figure out how to do it later.
Is this for the show that you co-hosted? You
I
had
co-hosted a show, yeah.
yeah,
Originally,
yeah.
it was with someone I co-hosted, and we got the gig.
But was that more of a music show? It wasn't current affairs based.
It was kind of culture and the arts and creative scene in London, because
Right.
also I had made a name for myself as a poet in this scene. People knew me from that. And so I was pretty tapped into the creative side of London. I was about. And so, I did that show, but I've always had an interest in politics and current affairs. And so the jump was pretty easy. And I mean, the story's boring, but fast forward 4 years later, I've done documentaries for Radio 4. I present on Radio 4 occasionally, BBC 5 Live, which is national. I've done documentaries for World Service. And then 4 years later, from my first pilot, I now host the breakfast show on BBC Radio London, which is a mix of politics, current affairs, things that are happening in the city, as well as all the arts and culture stuff as well, whatever's important to London. So obviously that's big national stories with a London
Yeah,
lens,
of
and
course.
it's local stuff as well.
And do you get to bring in your particular interest of about women, diversity? Do you get to sort of set the agenda a little bit from that perspective?
Well, this is exactly it, right? So, and this is why I do it, and I love radio, so I always want to do radio. But I think about the things that I talk about on my Instagram, and I talk about women's rights, and I talk about what it means to be a woman in this world. And that's my foundation to everything that I do. It's womanhood. I am obsessed with womanhood. I am perpetually angry at the injustices that we face. I am so vexed that we've been fighting for so long, and we have been fighting this hard, and we're still not where we even are close to needing to be. And so I exist in this angry state, and I talk about it on my Instagram. And yeah, there's thousands of people there, and that's wonderful. But the majority of those people agree with me.
Yeah.
That is an echo chamber. And it's lovely, and it's a community, but it's an echo chamber. They are with
And
me
it's
already.
self-reassuring and self-affirming. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I remember thinking, would I do more good going mainstream and having this conversation to, 50-year-old Joe, who's a plumber, who's never met people like me, and his circle is not likely to cross people like me, and he doesn't know much about BLM, and probably has never protested for anything, either the Iraq war or a woman's march, or for George Floyd. Has never done those things, is never going to cross his social circles. Is it better that every day I can talk about the news and I can tell the stories in a way that is compassionate and empathetic, and through the lens of women, and not just that, but women of color? And will that change Joe's mind a little bit? And will that bring Joe round a
Absolutely.
little bit more? And that's millions of people that you get to broadcast to every morning.
And you're doing your bit to bridge that gap. And that's what's needed. It's needed to raise awareness, to bridge the gap. I mean, it's vital. It's
Right. And
vital.
also, I'm a working class kid, right? So the BBC is
Yeah.
infiltrated with middle class people. So I want to bring that
Absolutely.
voice as well. And I've had slack over the years for being part of the BBC, when the BBC has come under fire, and no, they don't get it right all the time. But I always think, don't I do more good here at the table? And I'm in charge of my own show. I have the breakfast show. It's the
Yeah.
flagship show of any station, and it's incredible that I have it after 4 years. And I set the agenda on that show. I say to my team,
Yeah.
and I said to them yesterday, Today on the program, we're doing child marriage. We're going to talk about the importance of it, why it's important that the marriage age has risen from 16 to 18. We're going to cover that. Get me women to talk to. Get me women who've experienced this. Get the commentators and the barristers. Make sure they're women. Bring them on my show. I can platform that. I don't get to platform that on my Instagram. I don't get
That's
to,
right.
I have the Mayor of London on my show. I have political leaders on my show. I get to talk to the commissioner of the police force about why he's not protecting women in London. I get to have those conversations that my Instagram, as great as it is, and it's not going to afford me those conversations. So where do I do more good, right?
Amazing. I love it. I loved our chat. It was really great.
Thank you for such an enlightening conversation.
Thank you for joining me today. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review in your favorite podcast app. On our bonus episode for members, which comes out next week, Salma and I talk more about the impact of her work and, of course, her fantasy dinner party guests. You can get our bonus episodes by subscribing on our website as well as on Apple Podcasts. What I Did Next is brought to you from A&T Media, and it's hosted by me, Malak Fuad. It's also co-produced by Chirag Desai. You can follow us for more on our website, Instagram, Twitter, and on LinkedIn. Just search for What I Did Next. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with our final guest of season 6. Hope to see you then.